I have to teach you about something called resources in Rails and just get you to understand it a little bit better because it's going to be essential to building anything inside of any Rails application. So most things in your apps are resources. I'll give you some example. Users, tweets, comments, photos, stories, pins, Uber drivers, passengers, pickups, really anything. What is a resource? What makes something a resource is anything that you can perform the 4 major CRUD actions on, or a subset of them. The 4 major CRUD actions are create, read, update, and delete. Now it's important, repeat those 4 things to yourself over and over again until you really internalize them. Create, read, update, delete. Create, read, update, delete. Basically, the 4 things that you need to be able to do to anything in a database, or that you need to be able to do. Imagine you have an Excel sheet and it's got your columns and your headlines, and you need to be able to add a new row. You need to be able to look at it to actually get the information from the row. You need to be able to change the information in that row, and you need to be able to delete that row. Those are the 4 major actions. And if you can do those 4 things on something, it's a resource. Some resources only need a subset of those things, so maybe just creating and deleting. But I'll give you an example. Think of logging into a website as a resource. The resource is actually a session, and a session is what gets created when you log in. So logging in is creating a session. Now, a session really is actually just a cookie on your computer that identifies the user. So a session has a user on it. It also has a little bit of extra info that they might need to remember about you or says something about who you are. And logging out is just deleting a session. Okay, so remember the 2 of the 4 we have there, creating, deleting. We've already talked about users as a resource. You can create one, you can read one, which would basically be like looking at their profile page. You can edit a user, although only users should be able to edit their own profiles, but that's still editing nonetheless. There's just a limited subset of people who are allowed to do that editing. And you can delete a user, or at least a user can delete their own user. What about following as a resource? Yeah, I know. I mean, it gets crazy because you think create, read, update, destroy. There must be more than those 4 things, but you can really use those 4 things as a way of basically almost being able to do everything. Following a user in most apps is really just, there's a resource called a user follow, right? It seems weird. A user follow has basically 2 properties, the user that is being followed and the user that is doing the following, just like a user has a name or an email. Those 2 things are just have IDs on them. And when you follow someone, you're just creating a new user follow with your ID as the follower and the other person's ID as the person being followed. And if you unfollow someone, you're deleting that user follow. So this is really what's happening behind the scenes inside of most applications. It's just performing a series of CRUD actions. And these resources are related to each other. And that's what our models are going to help us do. They're going to help us understand that a user can have many user follows, which is basically the people that are following them or the people that they're following. A user can have a login session. A user can have pictures. A user can have stories. You can think of votes as a resource. When you vote on a story on Reddit, when you click upvote, you're really creating an upvote that has you as a property and it has the story as a property. And that's how it's linking the 2. So how does resources and MVC come together? MVC is the framework that Rails uses. Now, I've mentioned to you this many times in the past. Rails has models, views, and controllers. So if we go back to that model, that example, rather, that I showed you where you have your web pages, your database, and the rules in between, well, the web pages are the view, the rules are the controller, and the model is basically the database, right? That's how I explained it initially. But that's not a full enough picture for us to really understand how we have to build this stuff ourselves. So let's go a little deeper. Let's peel back one layer. Here's how it really works. you have a user and they're interacting with your routes, and that's sending you to a controller, which is then getting data from the model, and then the controller gets the view involved, and then gives it back to the user. So it really goes like this. Number one, the user goes to a website through the URL, hits the routes file. The routes file then determines which controller needs to be called, because you're going to have many controllers. All of that depends on what resource as a user you're trying to get to. That's number two. And then the controller needs to figure out what stuff to get out of the database. So step number 3 happens here. And then the database, the model, gives information back to the controller. That's number 4. Number 5, the controller gives that information to the view, which then pretties it up and basically puts it into HTML. The view gives the HTML code back to the controller, and then the controller just passes that at the end of the day back to the user. So it's these 7 steps here, right? These 7 magical steps. All of this is happening every time you visit a website. So the path, the actual files that it goes to, depends on the resource. So in our example, we created a tweet. So it's going to our routes.rb file. We've seen that one before, which will then pass it to the tweets controller. And it knows this because of the website a user goes to. So let's say the user makes a GET request to tweet/1, or actually it should be tweets/1 there. Well, the route file, the routes.rb, is going to interpret that, and it's going to basically say, okay, this needs to go to the tweets show action, because the user wants to see a particular tweet, and that's what the show action does. We'll get to that in a second. So the routes file basically says, now go to the tweet controller and invoke the show action there. And the tweets controller says, all right, in order to show a tweet, I need to get that from the database. So it runs this command, tweet.find params ID. It passes the ID that the user initially gave when it went to get tweets/1. That 1 is the ID. So the controller gives that to the model, which is called tweet.rb. And then the model gives that tweet back through this variable. The variable here is called @tweet. And so the tweets controller has the variable @tweet, and it gives it to the tweets show view, because remember that's the action that initially got called. And then the tweet show view will basically create the HTML with that tweet and gives that back to the user. All right, a lot's going on, and this is going to take a little bit of practice to really get a hang of. Well, we're going to have to go through it a few times. But if it's even starting to make a little bit of sense, that should be good. If kind of common sense kicks in here, you understand what's going on, that's okay for now. Now I want to talk about the 7 controller actions. To do CRUD, you need 7 controller actions. Now, why? Didn't I say that CRUD was just 4 things? Create, read, update, delete? That's true, but now I'm going to show you why 7 controller actions need to be involved in all of that. You've got index, show, new, edit, create, update, and destroy. You don't need to memorize all of these, by the way. CRUD, the 4, pretty useful to memorize, but these 7 you don't need to memorize. But I'm going to show them to you now, and I'll walk you through each one. Your index. This is where you see all of the tweets. This is basically a page that shows you, every tweet, or every user, or every whatever. It's a list. Your show. This shows you a specific tweet. The new. This actually gives you a form where you can create a new tweet. And the edit. This gives you a form where you can edit a tweet. So these ones, the ones on the left I just showed you, these do what's called rendering views. They actually have a view associated with them. However, the 3 on the right don't. So what do they actually do? Well, they live in between those other ones. So when you go to create a new tweet, you're calling the new action, which basically loads the page, which shows a form, and you're putting in information. And what happens when you click Create Tweet is that you're actually going to the create action, which is saving the tweet in the database. And once that's done, it doesn't create its own page, it just forwards to the show action, which then shows the tweet, right? So the create is kind of in between. The create is what happens after new. The same is true for edit. When you edit a tweet and you click update tweet, it actually goes to the update action. And then once that has successfully saved, it renders your show. Now, mind you, for both of these, if the create or the update fails, it actually reloads the page before with error messages. So this action in between does a little bit more in terms of logic to figure out what the next page is to show, but I'm showing you the ideal version, in which case everything works. And the last one, the destroy that I mentioned, let's say you click destroy a tweet on the index page, you'll get this little pop-up that says, are you sure? Okay, yes. And when you click OK, it loads the destroy action, which deletes the tweet. And then after that, it sends you back to the index page with a little message that says the tweet was successfully destroyed. Okay? So that was a lot. And that understanding we'll have to have in order to now go in and start to mess with tweets so that we actually can get it to work the way we want it to work.